He was invisible to everyone. Just the janitor mopping floors no one cared to notice. Every day, whispers followed him through the marble halls of one of America's top universities. But on that morning, when a proud professor mocked him for daring to think he could understand her equations, something extraordinary happened. What she didn't know was that the man she humiliated once dreamed of standing where she stood. And before the day ended, the world would see who truly belonged there, and who never did. Jordan Reed's life was built on silence and shadows. Every dawn, he walked through the towering gates of Westbridge University, a place where names carried more weight than minds. His gray janitor uniform blended into the marble walls as he mopped the same polished floors where young scholars discussed theories he once dreamed of presenting. To most, he was invisible, a man who existed only when something needed cleaning. But behind those tired eyes lived a quiet brilliance no one bothered to see. Years ago, Jordan had been a top mathematics student. Numbers spoke to him like poetry, patterns unfolding with beauty only he could feel. But when his mother's health collapsed and medical bills piled up, school became a luxury he could no longer afford. The scholarship he'd worked for disappeared beneath life's brutal arithmetic. Survival over ambition. So he traded chalk for bleach, notebooks for rags, and the sound of applause for the squeak of a mop. Still, his passion never died. Between shifts, he hid torn textbooks inside his supply cart, working through complex equations during stolen moments. While professors lectured about abstract theories, Jordan quietly solved problems that had haunted him for years, his mind sharper than ever, just unseen. Westbridge was a world of hierarchy. Students flaunted their privilege, professors carried authority like a crown, and workers like Jordan were background noise. Among them was Professor Victoria Hale, renowned, proud, and utterly convinced that intelligence belonged only to those with degrees. Her lectures drew crowds. Her arrogance drew silence. The morning their paths crossed would change everything. What began as another cleaning round in her lecture hall would ignite a moment of humiliation, a spark of rebellion, and a revelation that would challenge everything Westbridge believed about genius, race, and worth. Jordan was about to prove that brilliance needs no permission to exist. The morning it happened began like any other. Jordan had been polishing the lecture hall floors before the day's first class. The scent of disinfectant hung in the air, and sunlight poured through tall windows that looked down on manicured lawns. He worked quietly, careful not to disturb the professors preparing their notes. That's when he heard her voice, sharp, confident, echoing across the room. Professor Victoria Hale stood at the blackboard, writing a string of complex equations. Her reputation stretched far beyond Westbridge University. Students called her the mind that never faltered. She lectured with precision, every gesture deliberate, every sentence heavy with intellect and pride. When the janitor's cart creaked across the room, a few students snickered. Jordan ignored them, as always. But then Victoria's chalk paused mid-air. Her eyes flicked toward him, first with mild irritation, then with the quiet superiority of someone who had already decided his worth. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her tone cutting through the murmurs. "Could you please wait outside until we're done?" "This isn't a maintenance hour." Jordan nodded, backing toward the door. But his gaze lingered for just a moment on the equation sprawling across the board. Something was off. A tiny error buried in the second line. One that would unravel the entire proof. He didn't plan to say anything, yet the mathematician in him, the part that refused to die, couldn't stay silent. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I think there's a mistake in that step." Laughter erupted across the room. Students leaned forward, some amused, others smirking. Victoria froze, her eyes narrowing. "I'm sorry?" she asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "The variable in the third term." "It's inverted," Jordan said, his voice steady. A long, uncomfortable silence followed. Then, with a forced smile, Victoria replied, "I see we have a mathematical expert among the cleaning staff." Her words drew another round of laughter. "Please don't pretend you understand this. It's far beyond your pay grade." The humiliation cut deep. Every mocking chuckle felt like a weight pressing on his chest. But Jordan didn't move. Instead, he set down his mop and stepped closer to the board. "May I?" he asked quietly. Victoria's smirk faltered. She allowed it, perhaps certain he'd embarrass himself further. But as Jordan picked up the chalk, the air changed. His hand moved with purpose, rewriting her proof line by line, correcting the error, and completing the equation in a way that made perfect mathematical sense. For a full minute, the room was silent, just the sound of chalk scratching against the board. When he finally stepped back, the solution glowed under the morning light, elegant and exact. Victoria stared, her confidence flickering for the first time. The laughter died. Whispers filled the room. Astonishment. Disbelief. He returned the chalk gently, eyes lowered. "It balances now," he said simply. By the time he left, the whispers had turned into murmurs that spread across campus like wildfire. The janitor corrected the professor. Within hours, his name was everywhere. Some called him a fraud, claiming he'd memorized the formula from a textbook. Others said it was impossible, a fluke. Security began watching him more closely, suspicious of his presence in academic buildings. Faculty meetings whispered his name like an inconvenience, but there were those who began to wonder, who was this man that the university had overlooked? And as Victoria stared at the board that evening, still haunted by the elegant solution she couldn't refute, she realized one truth that terrified her more than humiliation itself. The man she had tried to silence might be smarter than everyone in that room. Days turned into whispers, and whispers into headlines. Jordan's quiet act of brilliance had become a storm the university couldn't contain. Some called him a prodigy in disguise. Others dismissed him as a fraud who'd stolen someone's work. But for the first time in years, the janitor had a name people couldn't ignore. Professor Victoria Hale, furious and humiliated, announced the Westbridge Mathematics Challenge, an open test of intellect meant to restore academic order. Her words were polished, but everyone knew what it really was, an attempt to prove that Jordan's brilliance was nothing more than luck. The auditorium was packed. Cameras flashed. Professors from rival universities filled the aisles. Jordan stood at the back of the stage in his gray uniform, mop handle resting by the door, hands trembling. Not from fear, but from the weight of every time he'd been overlooked, dismissed or made small. Victoria stood before the blackboard, chalk in hand, her expression cold and composed. "If you truly understand mathematics," she said, her voice echoing across the hall, "then solve this." The board filled with complex symbols, an equation that even doctoral candidates would struggle to touch. Gasps rippled through the audience. Jordan stared for a long moment. The silence was suffocating. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. Each sound of his boots against the tile seemed to echo louder than the last. He picked up the chalk with steady hands, the same way he had picked up every burden life had thrown at him. His movements were calm, deliberate, each stroke of chalk carving truth into the board. Victoria's smirk faded as the room fell into absolute silence. Line by line, Jordan dismantled the impossible problem with the ease of someone who saw the language of numbers rather than learned it. When he finished, he stepped back, breathing slow and even. The equation was flawless, beautiful, undeniable. The judges verified it once, then twice. Murmurs spread. One word echoed through the hall. Correct. Victoria froze, her face pale, pride shattering before hundreds of eyes. Jordan, the man she had mocked for his skin, his uniform, his job, had just solved what she couldn't. The crowd erupted. But Jordan didn't smile. He just looked at her and said quietly, "I didn't need your permission to be brilliant." When the applause finally faded, the silence that followed was louder than anything Jordan had ever heard. Professors who once ignored him now stood frozen, their pride dissolving into quiet disbelief. Cameras captured every second, the janitor who had outsmarted the system built to keep him beneath it. For years, they had walked past him without a word. Now, the same people whispered his name with reverence, as if they had just discovered something rare. But Jordan didn't crave their approval. He gathered his notes, placed the chalk down, and stepped away from the board. He knew the victory wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had been underestimated, overlooked, or judged before being known. Professor Hale avoided his eyes. For a moment, she looked small, stripped of the arrogance that once defined her. "You've proven your point," she murmured. But Jordan simply nodded. "No," he said softly, "I've proven yours wrong." In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond Westbridge. News outlets called it the janitor's equation. Universities debated what it meant for merit, race, and privilege. And while the world moved on to new headlines, something inside those marble halls changed forever. The next time a worker walked through campus, students looked up. The next time a professor passed a janitor, they hesitated before assuming. Jordan didn't seek fame. He went back to his shift. Same gray uniform, same quiet smile. But the world no longer saw him the same way. Because what he'd done couldn't be mopped away or erased. It was written into history with chalk and courage. In a world that measures worth by titles and skin color, he reminded everyone that genius doesn't need credentials. It only needs a chance. And so the question lingers. How many more brilliant minds are hidden behind uniforms society refuses to see? If this story moved you, share it. Because sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones we walk past every single day. Don't miss more powerful real-life stories. Hit subscribe now.